When David and Rachel Miller first set foot in their new Texas estate, they were in awe of its grandeur. The mansion had belonged to the legendary boxer George Foreman, a man known for his 2 heavyweight championships and his larger-than-life personality. The sprawling 45-acre property was as much a symbol of his success as his famous grills and comebacks in the ring. David, a tech entrepreneur, had made his fortune in artificial intelligence, while Rachel, a former journalist, had a keen interest in history. They wanted a place to escape from Silicon Valley's chaos, a sanctuary where their 2 children, Oliver and Sophie, could grow up surrounded by nature. The mansion seemed perfect too perfect. The previous owners, Foreman's family, had sold the house quickly after his passing in 2025. Just didn't feel the same without him, his son had said when handing over the keys. But David and Rachel thought nothing of it. They were thrilled to own a piece of history. On their first night, after a long day of unpacking, Rachel stood in the massive kitchen, gazing at the oversized island where she imagined Foreman once ate breakfast. The house was silent except for the occasional whisper of wind outside. Then she heard it, a rhythmic, distant thump, thump, thump. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of fists hitting a punching bag. Rachel followed the noise down the long hallway toward the gym, where Foreman had trained well into his later years. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from a motion-sensitive light flickering on in the corner. The speed bag in the center of the room swayed slightly, as if someone had just struck it. A cold shiver crawled up her spine. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "The air conditioning must have kicked on," she muttered. But when she turned to leave, she caught a scent in the air, musky, warm, and familiar. It reminded her of something. Cologne. A strong, old-school kind. The same kind George Foreman had worn in his interviews. Rachel barely slept that night. She told herself the house was just settling, that old buildings made noises, that air vents could move objects if positioned just right. And yet, the sensation of standing in the gym lingered with her, the faint motion of the speed bag, the distinct scent of cologne that had no reason to be there. David slept soundly beside her, oblivious, his arm draped over his chest, his face turned away. She stared at the ceiling, the soft glow of moonlight casting silver lines across the high, wooden beams. The house was too quiet. In their old home in San Francisco, they'd been used to distant traffic, the hum of late-night conversations from pedestrians below their apartment window. Here there was nothing. Then a creak. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Came from the hallway just outside their bedroom door. A slow, deliberate sound, like the weight of a foot pressing against an aging wooden floorboard. She turned her head toward the doorway, her body stiff beneath the covers. The door was open just a crack. Hadn't she closed it before bed? A sliver of darkness stretched into the hallway, but she could see nothing beyond. Then, another sound. Not a footstep. Something softer. A breath. Low and deep, like the exhale of a man after a long workout. Rachel bolted upright. Her heart pounded in her ears. The logical part of her mind told her it was just the house, just her nerves, but the other part, the primal, ancient part that knew when it was being watched, told her she wasn't alone. She reached out and shook David's arm. "David," she whispered. He groaned, rolling onto his side. "What?" "There's someone in the house." That woke him up. He sat up groggily, rubbing his face. "What are you talking about?" "I heard something. In the hallway." David listened, holding his breath. The house remained silent. He sighed and swung his legs over the bed. "It's an old house, Ratch. Probably just the wood shifting." But Rachel shook her head. "No, it was breathing. I swear. I heard someone breathe." David exhaled heavily, but he got up anyway. He wasn't the type to dismiss her fears outright, even if he didn't believe them. He grabbed his phone and flicked on the flashlight, sending a harsh beam of white light into the hallway. Rachel held her breath as he stepped out. The hall stretched long and empty, the walls adorned with framed photos of Foreman in his prime. Some were signed, others simple black and white shots of him raising his gloves in victory. The ceiling was high, the floors polished, the rugs muffling David's steps as he moved further away. He checked the front door. Locked. He peered into the living room. Nothing. He even stepped into the gym, shining the light over the punching bags and weight racks. The speed bag hung still. Nothing, he called back. Go to sleep. Rachel tried. She really did. But the house no longer felt welcoming. Felt inhabited. The next morning was bright, too bright. The Texas sun filtered through the large bay windows, casting golden hues across the kitchen counters. Oliver and Sophie sat at the island, their plates full of scrambled eggs and toast. Rachel sipped her coffee, trying to shake off the unease of the night before. David had already put the incident behind him, flipping through emails on his tablet. We should take the kids into town today, he said between bites of toast. Check out the local spots. Rachel nodded absently, but her mind was elsewhere. Then Oliver spoke. Mom, he said, his fork hovering over his plate. Were you in my room last night? Rachel set her coffee down slowly. No, honey. Why? The boy frowned. I thought I saw someone, a big man, standing by my door. Her blood turned to ice. What? He was tall and bald. I think he was looking at me. Rachel stared at him, unable to find words. David chuckled. You probably dreamed it, buddy. Oliver shook his head. I wasn't dreaming. Sophie, the younger of the two, swung her legs beneath her chair. Maybe it was the boxer, she said, her voice light, like she was talking about a cartoon character. Maybe he still lives here. Rachel turned to David, her skin prickling with cold. For the first time, she saw doubt in his eyes. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The morning stretched on with an uneasy stillness. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, their branches casting restless shadows against the mansion's tall windows. The usual sounds of a household waking up, plates clinking, footsteps on tile. The low hum of the refrigerator felt distant, muted, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Rachel tried to push aside Oliver's words, but they gnawed at the back of her mind. A tall, bald man watching from the doorway? It was too specific, too vivid to be a child's imagination. And the way Sophie had spoken so casually, as if it was simply a fact that George Foreman's spirit still resided here, unnerved her. As David loaded the kids into the car, planning a trip into town, Rachel lingered in the kitchen, staring at the long hallway that led toward the gym. It was ridiculous, she told herself. And yet, her feet moved before she could stop them, carrying her down the corridor. The framed photos of Foreman seemed to watch her as she passed. His expressions frozen in time, grinning with his championship belt slung over his shoulder, staring intensely before a fight, mid-swing in the ring, sweat glistening on his forehead. When she reached the gym, she hesitated. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of old leather and faintly lingering sweat, as though the place had been used just moments ago. The treadmills stood motionless, the weight racks untouched. But in the center of the room, under a slant of sunlight coming through the skylight, the speed bag hung from its mount, motionless. Rachel stepped forward, her breath shallow. And then THMP, 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 THMP. The sound exploded through the room. Rapid, rhythmic, unmistakable. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her eyes locked on the bag as it snapped back and forth, jerking under the force of invisible fists. The strikes were precise, methodical, like a boxer warming up before a fight. She could almost see it. A broad-shouldered silhouette standing before the bag, muscles shifting, gloved fists moving in perfect tempo. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The bag slowed its swings. A final, slow creak echoed through the empty room before everything fell silent. Rachel clutched the doorway, her pulse hammering in her ears. She forced herself to step forward, reaching out with trembling fingers to still the bag completely. The leather was warm. She spun on her heel and ran. The drive into town was uneventful, but Rachel's mind wasn't on the quaint storefronts or the charming old diner David had picked for lunch. She pushed her food around on her plate, glancing at the other customers, locals who had probably lived here long enough to remember when Foreman was alive, when this town was still home to a world champion. The waitress, an older woman with deep laugh lines and a southern drawl, noticed Rachel's distraction. "You folks are the ones who bought the Foreman place, right?" she asked, refilling Rachel's coffee. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, we just moved in a few days ago." The waitress gave her a knowing smile. "Bet that house still feels like his, huh?" Rachel blinked. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. "A man like that, he don't just disappear. He poured his soul into that place. Spent hours in that gym, pushing himself, talking to God. Some folks say a house holds on to energy, especially when a man has unfinished business." Rachel's stomach twisted. "Unfinished business?" The waitress shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe he still thinks he's got one more fight left in him." Rachel swallowed hard. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She turned to David, expecting him to scoff, but he wasn't paying attention. He was watching Oliver, who was drawing on the paper placemat with a crayon. Rachel leaned over. "What are you making, sweetheart?" Oliver held it up. Her heart nearly stopped. It was a stick figure, a tall, muscular man. His hands were covered in big red gloves. He had no hair, and he was standing in front of a punching bag. The rest of the day passed in a haze. They returned home before sunset, and Rachel did everything she could to distract herself, unpacking, organizing, putting on music a little too loudly to keep the house from feeling so still. By the time night fell, the tension had settled into her bones. She got ready for bed in silence, brushing her teeth mechanically, avoiding her own reflection in the mirror. David seemed tired, distracted. The kids had gone to bed without complaint. It was as if the entire house had collectively exhaled, sinking into a quiet she didn't trust. Rachel climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, willing herself to sleep. But as the house settled into darkness, a new sound reached her ears. A distant, low chant. Faint at first, almost like the wind, but unmistakable. A crowd. A roar of voices, swelling and fading, like thousands of people cheering somewhere just beyond the walls of the house. And then, ding, ding, ding. The sound of a boxing bell echoed through the empty hallways. Rachel's eyes snapped open. Somewhere in the house, the fight had begun. Rachel sat upright, her breath caught in her throat. The sound of the boxing bell still rang in her ears, distant yet sharp, as though it had echoed through time itself. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't blink. Then, she heard it again. The low, distant roar of a crowd. A rolling wave of voices, indistinct but full of energy, as if thousands of people were watching something unfold just beyond the walls of the house. She turned to David, but he was fast asleep. The rise and fall of his breathing was steady, undisturbed. She swallowed hard and swung her legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she crept toward the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, save for the moonlight streaming in through the tall windows. Shadows stretched long across the floor, distorting the familiar shapes of furniture. The noise was coming from downstairs. Rachel hesitated. There was no reason to go looking, no reason at all. And yet, some part of her, some deep, unshakable instinct told her that whatever was happening had already found her. She stepped forward. The wooden floorboards barely creaked beneath her as she moved down the staircase, each step slow and deliberate. The house felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. The air thick, charged with something unseen but undeniable. Then, as she reached the first floor, the sound changed. The distant crowd faded, replaced by something much closer. THMP. A single, heavy impact. Rachel froze. Then, THMP. 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 A rhythm. Deliberate. Controlled. She knew exactly what it was. A man hitting a punching bag. Her stomach clenched as she turned toward the gym. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening, she could see movement. A shadow shifting just beyond the frame. She reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the door open. The gym was not empty. The speed bag swung violently, jerking back and forth under the force of unseen fists. The overhead lights flickered as if struggling against the weight of something pressing against the air itself. The temperature had dropped, and the room smelled thick with sweat and something deeper: leather, blood, the raw scent of an old fight. And then, she saw him. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A massive figure standing in the center of the room. His back was turned to her, his shoulders heaving with each breath. The outline of his arms, thick and powerful, flexed as he lifted his fists. The air shimmered around him, like heat rising from pavement. Rachel's knees locked. She tried to speak, to say anything, but her throat tightened, strangling the words before they could form. Then, as if sensing her presence, the figure stopped. The speed bag stilled instantly. For a long, terrifying moment, silence filled the room. And then, the figure turned. Rachel saw his face. Or rather, she saw the idea of his face. He was there, and yet he wasn't. His features flickered, shifting between moments in time: young and victorious in the ring, older and smiling in interviews, drenched in sweat after a brutal fight. His eyes were deep-set, dark, watchful. A deep, slow breath rumbled from his chest. And then he spoke. His voice was low, steady. "One more round." Rachel's heart slammed against her ribs. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over herself as the words echoed in the empty room. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, waiting. One more round. The words settled in the air like dust, lingering long after they were spoken. Rachel had no idea what they meant, but she was starting to think that George Foreman, whatever remained of him, wasn't done fighting yet. Rachel could hardly breathe. The words "one more round" hung in the air, weighty and inescapable. The figure before her remained still, his broad shoulders squared, his gloved hands lowered just slightly, as if waiting for something. The gym felt heavier now, the air thick with something ancient, something unresolved. The distant echoes of a cheering crowd still rang in her ears, but they weren't just coming from the walls anymore. They were inside her head. Rachel's legs felt weak, but some deep, primal part of her refused to collapse. She took a slow, trembling step backward. Then another. The figure remained where he was, and yet his eyes followed her. She reached the threshold of the gym, gripping the doorframe for support, and turned sharply, running back toward the stairs. The moment she did, the house came alive. Thump. A footstep. Not hers. Thump. Thump. She didn't dare look back. The corridor stretched impossibly long ahead of her, the shadows shifting unnaturally against the walls. The distant crowd's roar grew louder, more frenzied, like they were anticipating something big, something final. Rachel pushed forward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She reached the staircase, stumbling in her rush to climb, her hands gripping the wooden railing for balance. Then suddenly, bam! A sharp, deafening impact exploded against the wall beside her, shaking the entire house. Rachel screamed, losing her footing as she scrambled up the last few steps. She turned her head, against every instinct, and saw it. A fist-shaped imprint dented into the wooden paneling of the hallway below. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't just a haunting. Something was trying to fight. She burst into the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. David stirred in bed, groggy, confused. "Rachel? What the hell?" She rushed to him, gripping his arms with shaking hands. "We have to go. Now." He blinked, still half asleep. What are you talking about?" She shook her head frantically, unable to put it into words. "He's still here. He won't stop. We need to go." David sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Rachel, slow down." Then the boxing bell rang again. Louder, closer. It shook the walls. David froze. His eyes darted toward the bedroom door. Then, bam! A single heavy knock. Neither of them moved. Another knock. Slower this time. More deliberate. Bam! It wasn't a request. It was a summons. David stood slowly, his breath unsteady. Rachel grabbed his wrist. "Don't." He didn't listen. With hesitant steps, he crossed the room and reached for the doorknob. Rachel wanted to stop him. She wanted to scream, to pull him back, but it was too late. David opened the door. The hallway beyond was dark, but not empty. The figure stood just beyond the threshold, his head slightly bowed, his hands wrapped in old, worn boxing gloves. His chest rose and fell in slow, deep breaths, and his eyes, those dark, unwavering eyes, locked onto David's. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the figure took a single step forward, and the floor shook beneath his weight. David staggered back, his face pale. Jesus Christ! But the figure raised a hand. Not in anger, not in violence. In a slow, methodical motion, he clenched his gloved fist and tapped it against his chest. A fighter's gesture. A sign of respect. David swallowed hard. He looked at Rachel, then back at the figure. What do you want? The answer came not in words, but in motion. The figure shifted his stance, lifting his fists. His movements were smooth, practiced, deliberate. The stance of a man who had spent a lifetime in the ring. And then, he waited. David understood before Rachel did. He wants a fight, he whispered. Rachel felt her blood run cold. What? David turned to her, his face unreadable. I think this is why he's still here. The realization settled between them like a weight. George Foreman wasn't haunting this house to terrorize its new owners. He wasn't trying to scare them away. He was waiting for one more round. David wasn't a boxer. He had never thrown a serious punch in his life. But when the figure took another step forward, waiting, watching, expecting, he knew there was no running from this. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't even about fighting. It was about acknowledging. David inhaled sharply and raised his fists, not in defiance, but in respect. The moment he did, the energy in the room shifted. The shadows softened. The heavy air lightened. The presence that had loomed so large now felt human. The figure gave a slow, approving nod. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway was empty. The air was still. David lowered his hands slowly, his pulse pounding in his ears. Did that just happen? Rachel didn't answer, because she didn't know how. That night, the house was finally quiet. No echoes of a distant crowd. No phantom punches in the gym. No knocks on the door. The energy that had once made the walls hum with unseen tension had faded, leaving only stillness in its wake. In the morning, Oliver and Sophie woke up peacefully for the first time since they'd moved in. At breakfast, Oliver tilted his head and asked, "Is the big man gone?" Rachel and David exchanged a look. "Yes," Rachel said softly. "I think he is." Sophie smiled. "Good." She took a bite of her toast, chewing thoughtfully. Then she added, "I think he won." Rachel swallowed hard. She looked around the kitchen, at the soft morning light spilling through the windows, at the framed newspaper clippings of George Foreman still hanging on the walls. She thought about the fight he had never stopped preparing for. The rounds he had fought long after the world had stopped watching. The one last battle he had needed to finish. And for the first time since moving in, the house felt like theirs. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.